Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in this evening for our online Bible study. Let's get into it. I welcome you. If you are new to this study, I'm Pastor Dave St. Alban. It's a joy to be with you here this evening. Tonight, we continue our look at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27. So I invite you to grab your Bibles, open them up to Matthew 27, beginning with verse 27. Grab something to take some good notes with, grab a beverage, and grab a snack. Let's get into it. Well, again, good evening and welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I do pray that your day has been going well. Pray that your week's been going well so far. Happy Wednesday. Good to be with you here again this evening as we continue our journey through the Bible one chapter at a time. And we are now in our 735th study together. We began this study way back in September 12th of 2022. And now we are inching closer to our 4-year anniversary here in just a couple months. But we started with Genesis chapter 1, and for the most part, each weeknight since that date, we've been going through the Bible a chapter at a time. We are now almost at the conclusion here of the Gospel of Matthew, and we are in chapter 27, which is a long chapter. This is the last of the long chapters in this Gospel. We are spending 3 nights in this particular chapter. Last night, tonight, and then we will wrap it up tomorrow. And then on Friday, we'll look at chapter 28, which is the last chapter of Matthew, and that will conclude our look at that gospel. And then Monday, we'll move into the Gospel of Mark. So we're making great progress, and whether this is your first time with us, or maybe you've been with us from the very beginning of this study almost 4 years ago, or maybe you joined somewhere in between, I welcome you. It's just a blessing to be with you here. Matthew 27. So just to recap where we were at last night, we looked at the arrest of Jesus and the trial, right? This mock trial before the Sanhedrin and then going before Pontius Pilate. Tonight we're going to look at the crucifixion, and Matthew is going to shift his focus now from the Sanhedrin, from the Jews, to emphasizing the abuse by the Roman soldiers on Jesus and the mockery of him. And then the narrative will shift to his actual death, which we will see tomorrow, and then the events that immediately followed his death, which, of course, the resurrection, which we will get into on Friday. So, a lot to look at here. Open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27. Beginning with verse 27, and if you don't have a Bible with you, not a problem. As always, all the verses are right here on the screen so you can follow along. Take some really good notes, and let's get right into it here and start with verse 27, where the narrative now shifts to the Romans and the abuse of Jesus by these Roman soldiers. So verse 27, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. So the soldiers in view here, these are the troops under Pontius Pilate. The praetorium was the official residence where Pilate stayed, which was Herod's palace near the Jaffa Gate today. There are some accounts that say this was at the Antonia fortress, but while the soldiers would have been housed there, Pilate himself would not have stayed there. He would have stayed in Herod's palace. So these soldiers take Jesus before Pilate and into the praetorium area, into this courtyard, and the whole company, which would have been about 600 soldiers, gathers around him. Verse 28, and they stripped him. They put a scarlet robe on him. So first, the Sanhedrin in chapter 26, they had abused Jesus as false Messiah. Now the soldiers are going to abuse him not as a false Messiah, but as a false king. And it's ironic here that Jesus was everything that he was mocked for. He was the Messiah. He was the king. And he's been mocked for both of these things. So they strip him. They put this scarlet robe on him, which would have been this reddish purple cloak that the Roman military would have wore, or civil officials would have wore this type of a cloak. Verse 29, they twisted together a crown of thorns and they set it on his head, meaning that they pushed it into his skull. It didn't just lay on his head. They wound this thing together, and these thorns would have been several inches long. These weren't little rose thorns. These were, I've seen these thorns in Israel before. They are several inches long, and they would have pressed this into his flesh. This crown of thorns would have resembled the crown that was on Caesar's head on the coins that were used, but that crown was made of palm branches. As king, as Caesar. Here, Jesus is mocked. He is given a crown of thorns. They put a staff in his right hand, then they knelt in front of him, and they mocked him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Verse 30, and they spit on him. They took the staff, they struck him on the head over and over and over. The tense of that Greek verb to strike or to beat means this was repeatedly. It wasn't just a couple times. They hit him again and again and again and again. And this type of mockery, it didn't as customarily accompany scourging. This was exceptional with Jesus' case. In fact, it was so exceptional that nothing resembling this has ever been found in record anywhere. That this was complete humiliation, brutal beatings, attack, beating him to death. Verse 31, and then after they mocked him, they took off the robe, put his own clothes back on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. So typically at a crucifixion, 4 soldiers plus a centurion would accompany a condemned prisoner to the crucifixion, and the criminal would normally carry the crossbeam, and the soldiers would later nail the hands of the criminal to this crossbeam, and the beam would be hoisted up onto this vertical pole. Now, these verses, 27 through 31 of this chapter, it reveals man's sinfulness at its worst. Mocking, beating, brutalizing the very person who is about to lay down his life as a sacrifice for sin. There's few incidents in history that clearly illustrate the brutality in the desperately wicked heart of man than what was inflicted on the Son of God, Jesus Christ. This, we have to remember, though, is by God's plan. It's not the Jewish hostility that is putting him on the cross. It's not the Roman injustice that's putting him on the cross. This is the declared purpose of God, that the Son of Man must die at the hands of sinners as a sacrifice. So now we move into the crucifixion in verses 32 through 44. And now the narrative in these verses focuses on the events surrounding the crucifixion. Simon of Cyrene, the soldiers, the thieves, or the bandits on the crosses on either side of Jesus, and this placard that is placed over Jesus' head on the cross, which really sums up everything that Matthew is all about. So the emphasis here in Matthew's gospel is of the mocking by the onlookers. And why is Matthew shifting to this? Because the readers of this time, they understood crucifixion all too well. There was no need to explain the gory details of a crucifixion to the readers of this day. They understood it. And that's why Matthew's gospel is not written so much in detail. But I'll include some things here just for some information so we all have a deeper understanding of really what the crucifixion was all about. So verse 32, as they were going out, so Jesus carries his cross, either this cross beam or the entire cross. He passes through the city and goes outside through the city gate. Normally, crucifixions took place outside the city wall, which is just symbolic of additional rejection by the people. Criminals were executed outside of the city walls for two reasons. For the Jews, to protect the Jews from the impurity that came from death and the shame of the crucifixion, and two, for the Romans, because the Romans wanted to advertise to people passing by what was going to happen to condemned traitors. Crucifixions happened all the time, and the bodies were often left on these crosses, lining these major roads that came in and out of the city as an example to others. This will happen to you if you decide to try to betray Rome. So this is taking place outside of the city, and on the way, so the soldiers, Jesus, the people, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon. And the soldiers, forced Simon to carry the cross. Simon's name, that's a Jewish name. He came from the town of Cyrene, which today would be in the country Libya in the city of Tripoli. That would be where Cyrene was, on the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. So he's just coming for Passover. The soldiers grab him and force him to carry this cross, which is, again, a piece of irony. Because here Simon is carrying the cross of Christ, when in reality, Jesus is bearing Simon's spiritual cross by dying in his place. Now, we understand this today, right? We have a better understanding. At the time that this happened, this would have been a bizarre turn of events here. Why is Simon carrying this criminal's cross? If anybody's going to carry it, it should be not Simon of Cyrene, but Simon Peter, because he had boasted in chapter 26, I'll die with you, right? Whatever happens, I'm there with you. But he's nowhere to be found. Instead, this other Simon is carrying the cross instead. Verse 33, and then they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. The word Golgotha is a Greek word. It's a transliteration of the Aramaic word Golgotha, which means skull. So this site is not named necessarily because the shape of the landscape looked like a skull. It was more so named this because of the skulls that were laying on the ground. And early Christian writers, early pagan writers, they gave horrific detail about the act of crucifixion, stating that the flesh of the bodies of those who had been crucified were often picked apart by the birds. They were eaten by the birds and any other wild animal that could get to them. And nothing would have been left except the bones to fall onto the ground, which accounted for the skulls here. So they go to Golgotha. Now, note there's nothing in the Gospels that indicates this is a hill. It's just a place, right? Golgotha. Now, we get the word Calvary. Where do we get Calvary from? That comes from the Latin calva, which means skull. So when we read, Jesus died on Calvary, it was the same place, just coming from Latin. Now, nobody knows the exact location of where this was. It was outside of the city. It was north of the old city wall of Jerusalem. So probably not too far from where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in Jerusalem. But nobody knows the exact place. And farther outside in Jerusalem is another area which is in a garden area, and this is considered to be the place of Golgotha as well as the tomb of Jesus, but nobody knows for sure. And the Via Dolorosa, which would have been the route that Jesus took from the trial before Pilate, his scourging, and then carrying the cross to Golgotha. The Via Dolorosa, which means the way of sorrow, traditionally it rests on the assumption that Jesus' trial took place in the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem, which I mentioned earlier. That's where the Roman soldiers stayed. But now there's new evidence that indicates that is not the actual Via Dolorosa. This would have happened outside of the city. And you can Google search this. It's really interesting, some of these archaeological finds that indicate now there's a whole different path that Jesus would have taken as he carried his cross. But now he's being led out to crucifixion. So verse 34, they come to Golgotha, and there they offer Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall. Now who's offering? Well, it could have been the women who were present offering this gall, which was wormwood. It was a type of myrrh to decrease the pain. It would have been a numbing agent. Maybe it was the soldiers offering Jesus this drink as an act of mockery, because wine mixed with myrrh was a delicacy that the kings drank, and Jesus is claiming to be a king. Whoever is offering this to him, he refuses to drink it after he tastes it. So he tastes it, he understands what this is. It's a numbing agent. He's choosing to be fully conscious going through this ordeal, so he refuses the drink. Verse 35, when they had crucified him. Now, crucifixion. Normally, the Romans would either tie the victim to the cross beam, his hands and arms, or they would nail his hands to this beam. In Jesus' case, they nail him to this cross beam. And then they would hoist this beam up with Jesus hanging from it, upright onto this vertical post. Now, this post would have been about 6 feet tall, which would accommodate most criminals because as they hung, they were bent at the knees as well. They weren't hanging straight down. There were other crosses at this time that were much taller, but those were normally the ones that lined the roads coming in and out of the cities to display to people passing by, this is what awaits you if you cross us. So Jesus would have been on this shorter beam, and with his hand, the executioner, the Roman soldier, would have probed around the wrist to find the hollow spot here on the wrist. It wouldn't have been in the hands. And when he found this hollow spot between the bones, he would take one of these square-cut iron nails and hold it against the spot. And, would have been, interestingly, here where the so-called lifeline on your hand ends, right? So it would have been right about here. Press this nail in and then with force, with all their might, strike it so that it goes into the flesh. They would do that with both hands and then hoist him up onto this vertical beam. And then once he's on the beam, they would fasten the criminal's feet to this upright beam by tying them to the wood with a rope. and then nail them into the wood with this 5-inch long nail. The way that this was done is the right foot would be over the left foot. This was difficult because if the feet were pulled too far down and the feet were nailed to the cross in the wrong place, the prisoner would always die quickly. So the Romans had learned through their executions to push the feet upward so that the condemned person could lean into the nails and push themselves back upwards. A very torturous procedure here. And sometimes these crosses were they were shaped like a T, like a capital T. Sometimes they were X's. And sometimes they were a T with the extension above the cross beam, which this is Jesus' type of cross. And we learn that, we'll see that here in verse 37. Most of the time, these criminals, the victim would have been just a few inches off of the ground. Jesus, when we get to verse 48 later, he was probably a few feet off the ground. But this wasn't way up several feet in the air. This would have been very close to the ground. Now, normally the Romans executed their victims naked, except for a loincloth. So here, these executioners, they take the clothing, right, and they take them for themselves. That would have included the sandals, the turban, the sash, which was a kind of belt, the inner garment, and the outer garment. In the case of Jesus, they're going to gamble for his clothes. And, how he was left here to hang on the cross, he most likely would have been stripped naked and then wrapped with this loincloth to cover himself. Spared the indignity of complete nudity. That would have been completely un-Jewish to do. So when prisoners were stripped naked, this cloth was placed on them, this loin cloth, so they at least had some covering. So Jesus here, he's stripped of his clothes, but he's probably covered up with this loin cloth. And they divided up his clothes by gambling for them, by casting lots. So instead of just taking his shoes, his sash, his inner and outer garments, they gamble them away. That's a fulfillment of Psalm 22:18. Crucifixion was unspeakably degrading, painful, whether the victim was tied to the cross or nailed to the cross. The body would have experienced countless spasms as they try to hoist themselves up, with their feet that are nailed into the wood, to try to relieve the lungs so they could breathe, but then they would come back down and their body would just spasm over and over again. Now, Jesus has been scourged, right? He's lost blood. He's in shock from the pain. And this type of torture could go on for days and days until finally the victim would die by suffocation or cardiac arrest or blood loss or whatever. When the Romans wanted to speed up the death, they would smash the victim's legs so they could no longer push themselves up, which would almost immediately cut off their breathing and they would die. Jesus died relatively quickly. They did not break his legs, which is also a fulfillment of Scripture. But this was a death reserved for the worst of the worst. And the Romans, they were exempt from crucifixion. Unless Caesar ordered it, they were exempt from it. For the Jews, and I'd mentioned this before, in Deuteronomy 21, hanging from a tree symbolized God's curse. So for the Jews, this was further humiliation that he says he's the Son of God, but he's really cursed by God. Verse 36, and then sitting down, they kept watch over him. Now, that's a verse that is unique to Matthew's gospel. Sometimes people would approach the cross and try to take these criminals down off the cross to prevent them from dying. So here, these soldiers are sitting down at the foot of this cross to make sure nobody does this. Jesus, nobody came to save him, right? He does, in fact, die here. Verse 37, so above his head, so we know that this upright beam where the cross is at, it has this extension of, because they placed a placard up there with the written charge, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." This was not unique to Christ. The Romans would often do this. They would write the charge of the criminal on this tablet with red or black ink, and they would attach it to the cross. This was a charge that Pilate had authorized. It's written in Aramaic, it's written in Greek, and it's written in Latin, and we see that from John 19. This was meant to be an insult to the Jews. The title King of the Jews meant Messiah to the Jews. And so Pilate here is saying this was the Messiah as a means to insult the Jews. Remember, they hated each other. But Pilate here is stating what Matthew has been teaching the readers of this gospel all throughout, that this is, in fact, the Messiah, the King of the Jews, that Jesus is the King of the Jews. That's the entire theme of this gospel. Here it's used in derision, but it's ironic that this sign placed over his head is exactly who he was. The way that other Gospels read this is that this is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But again, this is the whole message of Matthew's Gospel. Verse 38. So 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. So these 2 men crucified on either side of Jesus, these were freedom fighters. These were rebels, right? These weren't just simply thieves or robbers. These were rebels, insurrectionists. And so Jesus is hanging between these 2 men who wanted to bring in Messiah's kingdom through violent action against Israel's enemies, which is all contrary to God's will. And again, this Matthew may have had Isaiah in mind here, because this is all about fulfilling prophecy. So Isaiah 53:12 states that he was counted with the wrongdoers. So here he's executed with these 2 rebels. And those who passed by, verse 39, hurled insults at him, shaking their heads. So the Romans, they crucified people publicly to make them an example for others. So this must be close to a road where people are passing by. The leaders of Israel charged Jesus with being a blasphemer because of his claim in chapter 26 that he would be seated at the right hand of the Father. People passing by, though, they are really the ones that are speaking blasphemy. They are hurling abusive insults. The way that reads is they are literally blaspheming because they are charging Christ unjustly. And they said, verse 40, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." So these blasphemers continue to question Jesus' identity. This goes way back to the beginning of Matthew, when Jesus was tempted in the desert by Satan. If you are who you say you are, do this. Demonstrate who you are by doing this. But again, it's all in a way that was contrary to God's will. If you are the Son of God. Jesus heard that at the beginning of his ministry in chapter 4 with Satan. He hears it here at the end of his ministry with these blasphemy words spoken by these people. And it all expressed the problem that everybody had in identifying who Jesus was, that he is the Messiah. So here, Matthew shows the Jews mocking Jesus, just as we saw earlier in verse 37, that the Romans were mocking Jesus. Verse 41, in the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, the elders, the Sanhedrin, they're all mocking him. And he saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the king of Israel. So this reference to Jesus saving others goes back to his healing ministry, how he healed people. And so these religious leaders are trying to throw doubt on Jesus' healing ministry by claiming he can't even heal his own miserable condition. And of course, Jesus could have saved himself here. But that would have eliminated this salvation for all humankind had he saved himself. So in one sense, the words, he can't save himself, that's partially true. He couldn't, because had he done it, that would have eliminated his plan of salvation. So he could have done it from the standpoint of being able to, but he could not do it because that would have eliminated his plan of salvation. Let him come down now from the cross, and then we will believe in him. So they continue to point out this helplessness of Jesus on the cross, and they are implying that the reason they fail to believe is his fault, because he's not doing anything to prove it. They are promising to believe in him if he would come down off the cross. But again, if he had come down off the cross, there would be no salvation for anybody. Verse 43, he trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. Now, Jesus never directly said, I am the Son of God. He did say he would one day be sitting at the right hand of God. The chief priests interpret that as blasphemy. But what they mean is God's failure to rescue Jesus is proof that God did not delight in Jesus. Jesus claims to be the Son of God. These were pretentious claims. God is going to identify his Son by delivering him from death, but not in the way that these religious leaders wanted it to happen. In their eyes, God had turned his back on this blasphemer. Verse 44. And in the same way, these two rebels who were crucified with him, they also heaped insults on him. So these two insurrectionists who were crucified with Jesus, they joined everybody else in mocking him. None of the gospel writers recorded that anybody spoke up in his defense. And this section, verses 32 through 44, shows us the many different groups of people that mocked Christ. The Romans, the mob, the Jewish leaders, the two insurrectionists on the cross. This picture is the picture of the suffering servant who has been totally forsaken by everybody, completely misunderstood, completely rejected by everybody. But through all this, Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies about the Messiah. And that's where we're going to stop here tonight in Matthew's Gospel. And tomorrow we will finish up the Gospel of Matthew chapter 27. We will look at Jesus' death and his burial, and we'll pick up with verse 45. But thank you for being here this evening. I do pray that this has been a help to you, and I appreciate you being here tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Till then, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.